Hello, welcome to the Culture Quarter. I'm Siobhan Heaney. Coming up, from art room to art world, giving students gallery exposure. Plus, the Aussie glamour girl who turned swimming into an art form. But first, they're the men and women whose blood, sweat and progeny built colonial Australia. But how much do we know about the character of the convicts themselves? Well, by a stroke of luck, a group of convicts was photographed at Port Arthur in the 1850s, just as photography was coming into fashion and just as the penal system was on its last gasp. I spoke to the author and historian who unearthed this stash of photos. They were the last inmates of a dying system, the old crawlers, they called them. Their faces show us the marks left by a life of hardship in the penal system.
What I particularly look for is conversation. I want to hear their voices. And I think that's the magic, is to hear somebody's voice. The faces do add something, a colossal amount. And I think it's because we spend our entire lives looking at people's faces, trying to assess what they're thinking when we're talking to them.
Author and historian Edwin Barnard set out to explore a new layer of convict history, inspired by these dog-eared, card-sized photos. After trawling through the snapshots, which came from archives in Tasmania and the National Library in Canberra, he came up with a very intimate view of our convict ancestors. Thanks to digitised records like court reports and newspaper articles, he could immediately access information from here and the UK and quickly match each man to his story. He's compiled them in a book called Exiled.
When I discovered these photographs and picked out 20 that I was going to concentrate on, I really didn't know what the story was. But it turns out that they'd sort of divided themselves into three groups. There were a group that were called the incorrigibles. These were men that just would not behave themselves. And they spent most of their time, one in particular who arrived here in 1833, was still in jail in 1874. He'd been more or less continually locked up. So there were those, the incorrigibles. There were another group of rather sad individuals who just didn't fit in, really. They had to steal to live, and so they were in and out of jail. They might be out for a year, a couple of years, but then they'd be back inside again. And then the final group were men who'd more or less made successes of their lives and had committed some crime. In most cases it was manslaughter, and found themselves in Port Arthur right at the very end of the system.
One story that stands out is that of Dennis Doherty.
He was considered to be one of the most difficult prisoners ever to be transported to Tasmania, mainly because he was just would not do as he was told. Whatever they did to him, he refused to do what he was told, and was constantly trying to escape. And as a consequence, spent probably about 45 years in jails, in various jails.
And he originally committed a non-violent crime.
Yeah, that's right.
And yet he lived a life where he suffered a lot of violence as a result of his subsequent actions, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. He deserted from the army as a boy, and then spent the rest of his life paying for that.
What do you think it was about him that led him to refuse to submit to authority?
Just sheer bloody-mindedness, I think. Just a refusal to do what you're told. I don't know why, but I think of it as a sort of an Irish trait, actually, yes.
When asked by a visitor about his missing eye, Doherty simply explained,
"I lost it in the hardship of prison life."
He would just not do what he's told. And whatever they did to him, however hard they were hard to Doherty. At one time he was locked in a dark cell, which is a cell specially reserved. It's got walls a metre thick, double doors so no light can get in. He was confined to that for a year, in complete silence and complete darkness. Once a year he'd get his food put in once a day. But they just didn't break Doherty. he was determined. He was going to be free, and if that meant running away, then that's what he'd do to be free.
Then there was one George Langley. Transported at 15 for stealing silver, he towed the line and was soon freed. He married another ex-convict, Maria, and set up as a sawyer in southern Tasmania.
If they behaved themselves, as most did, they'd marry, they'd have children, they'd have work, they'd own land. And the fact that very few of them ever returned to Britain, I mean, apart from the fact that it was expensive to do so, seems to indicate that they realised they had a better life here. And certainly if you read a lot of the background to these men, there was nothing waiting for them back in Britain.
A child thief, George Langley had landed on his feet in Van Diemen's Land. But his life with Maria was far from ideal. He was soon in trouble for a much more violent crime.
It's a bit confused what happened, but somebody hears Maria saying, "Oh, George, don't kick me." And because she's fallen down drunk. George isn't so drunk. And anyway, it transpires that Maria's, the next morning, turns up dead.
Langley was serving 4 years for manslaughter at Port Arthur when this picture was taken. Why the photos were taken in the first place is a matter of some conjecture.
I can only think that it was for the purposes of identification, because police forces and prison officials around the world around this time were using photographs, mugshots, to identify convicts, rather than they had at one stage written lists of, the shape of a man's chin and the shape of his eyes, not a terribly reliable guide to picking somebody out in a crowd.
These images were intended to keep criminals within easy reach of authority. Now they allow long-dead convicts to reach out to historians hungry for information.
I asked myself that question throughout the entire book, because I sat there looking at these faces for 2 years trying to decide what they do tell us. The beauty of these 20 men, the 20 men in the book, is that these are nobody in particular. These are just 20 guys. They did nothing spectacular. They no brave acts, no great feats. No wonderful endings to their lives. They're just very average men. And I think that's part of the charm of it, is that here's the real story of the real convicts.
And what do you think the experience would have been like for these convicts, these complete unknowns, to be photographed like this?
Well, that's an interesting point, because certainly some of them, Doherty, who had been in jail since the 1830s, before photography was even invented, this was probably the first photograph he ever had taken. And you wonder whether he wondered how it turned out, because he almost certainly never saw it.
Spending time in the art room at school can be enough to inspire budding artists at a young age. But how can they get a feel for what the art world is really like? The National Gallery has set out to provide an insight into the art scene with a scholarship program in Canberra. From across the country, they've come for a special look into the heart of the Australian art industry.
The art world is a bit mysterious, I guess, being on the outside.
The 16 students were chosen from 400 applicants based on their artistic and written responses to a work, The Stags, by well-known Australian artist Patricia Piccinini. And this week they got to meet her in the flesh to discuss the work and quiz her about life as a professional artist.
It's like meeting a celebrity, really. It's just really good to hear her view on the artwork, because I've always been thinking about what I thought of it, and to hear what the artist thought is really interesting as well.
I'd like them to go away knowing that art is made by quite normal people, and that they can do it too, and that it is an exciting world.
Many of the students come from remote and regional Australia, and the scholarship's designed to open their eyes to a range of possible careers, as artists or in galleries and museums.
It's amazing. I just get shivers sometimes being in the gallery.
The week also includes practical workshops, like this one in Mount Stromlo's abandoned observatory, referencing a new National Gallery acquisition by American artist James Turrell.
With the imagery, we're just trying to bring a bit of life to the observatory, because in the Canberra fires a few years back it was burnt down.
And the week's already bringing sparks of creativity to life.
I'm a bit of a competitive person, so being around all these really talented and passionate people, I'm just going to jump in and start making some work.
Something for art lovers to look forward to. Her underwater acrobatics brought her worldwide fame. Annette Kellerman was an Aussie glamour girl and a true trailblazer who thumbed her nose at the conventions of fashion, theatre and feminine respectability. She even popularised the swimsuit in an era where women still wore pantaloons to the beach. Annette Kellerman was dubbed the Diving Venus, a silent film star who graced the silver screen with a unique art she called underwater ballet.
She was a woman who was happy to expose herself in ways that for the time were very radical.
She first took to the water in Australia, swimming competitively as a teenager and putting on diving displays. She took her talents overseas and made it big, and all that healthy Aussie flesh made her a fortune.
In the period between about 1910 and 1930, she was among the most famous women in the world, incredibly successful and popular.
She was proud of her physicality in a time when women were buttoned up to the earlobes, and she rejected modest swimwear in favour of the svelte one-piece. A siren of the seas as well as the screen, Annette Kellerman persisted with her swimwear revolution, even being arrested on a Massachusetts beach for indecency. But that didn't harm her popularity. A year later, a Harvard academic who took it upon himself to study 3,000 women declared her to be the perfect woman because of her physical similarities to the Venus de Milo. Kellerman had strong beliefs about the pursuit of physical perfection, even writing books instructing women on beauty and exercise.
Which taught them it's okay to be proud of yourself. There's nothing morally suspicious about a woman wanting to make the best of her body.
A submarine star, but no flake. And that's it for this episode. I'm Siobhan Henu, and I'll catch you next time on The Culture Quarter.